$211,614. That's the number. I sat at my kitchen table in Phoenix with a legal pad and a calculator, the kind with the little paper roll, and I added it up 3 times because I was sure I'd made a mistake. $211,614 given to my family over 18 years. And the thing that made me set the calculator down and press my palms flat on the table until my fingers turned white wasn't the total. It was that nobody else in my family could have told you it was even half that much. Because nobody was counting. Nobody had to. That was my job too. Let me go back. My name is Carmen Delgado. I'm 44 years old. I work as an insurance claims adjuster for a mid-sized firm in Phoenix, Arizona, and I have worked there for 18 years. I am very, very good at my job. Not good in the way people say when they're being modest about something they love. Good in the way that means I can look at a stack of medical bills and a police report and a water-stained ceiling photograph and tell you within 11 minutes whether the claim is legitimate, inflated, or fabricated from scratch. Good in the way that means my desk has a small brass plate that says Senior Fraud Analyst, even though my title is technically still Senior Claims Adjuster 3. Good in the way that means when the regional office in Tucson gets a case they can't crack, they email me, not my supervisor. I say this because I need you to understand something about the woman this story belongs to. She is not stupid. She is not naive. She is someone who spent nearly 2 decades cataloging other people's lies for a living and somehow could not see the ones waiting for her at home. Or maybe she could. Maybe she just decided every single morning to drink her coffee from a lumpy clay mug she made in her first pottery class and go to work and come home and write another check and call it love. That mug, by the way, sits on my counter right now. I made it 6 weeks after Javier died, and my hands were still shaking from something deeper than grief, and the walls are uneven, and the glaze pooled wrong on one side so it always looks like it's crying a little. It's the only thing in my apartment I made entirely for myself. I want you to hold that thought. My parents came from the Dominican Republic in 1979. They left behind a country that still carried Trujillo's shadow like a bruise that wouldn't yellow, and they came to New York, and then to Phoenix, and they built something. My father drove a produce truck. My mother cleaned office buildings. By the time I was 8 and my sister Yolanda was born, they had a 2-bedroom apartment with functioning air conditioning and a picture of La Altagracia above the door. And my mother said to me in the kitchen while I was doing homework at the table, "Carmen, you are the eldest. You understand what that means." I was 8. I understood nothing. But I nodded because she needed me to, and that nod became a career. I was a serious child. Teachers said this like a compliment. My mother said it like a fact of nature. Carmen is serious. Carmen is responsible. Carmen can handle it. And Yolanda was light. Yolanda was musical laughter and beauty pageant sashes, and the kind of girl who walked into a room and made it rearrange itself around her. I don't say this with bitterness. Not anymore. I say it because you need to see what I saw growing up. 2 daughters, 1 household, and a set of parents who divided us into the one who serves and the one who shines. They would not have described it that way. They would have said they loved us both equally. And I believe they believe that. But love and investment are different currencies, and they spent them in very different directions. When I was 14, my grandmother, my abuela, started setting aside money in a savings account with my name on it. She called it my quinceañera fund. Every month, a little bit from her Social Security, a little from the envelopes relatives sent at Christmas. By the time I was almost 15, there was $11,000 in that account. $11,000 in 1995 from a Dominican grandmother living on fixed income. That was a cathedral of sacrifice, coin by coin. I never had a quinceañera. My mother sat me down 3 months before my 15th birthday at that same kitchen table and explained that Yolanda needed the money for something important, a procedure. She didn't say what at the time. Years later, going through papers I should have gone through much sooner, I found the receipt, rhinoplasty. $11,000 from my abuela's hands went to straighten my sister's nose because she said the pageant judges would score her higher. My mother's explanation to me was 5 words long. "You were too mature for those things. Yolanda needed the experience." I remember my hands were under the table. I remember pressing my thumbnails into my palms, hard enough to leave crescents that lasted through dinner. I remember the sound of the faucet dripping behind my mother's head, and I remember thinking very clearly, with the kind of clarity that only arrives when something inside you accepts a truth it should reject. Okay, I am the one who does not need things. That was the foundation. Everything else was just floors added to a building whose blueprints were drawn when I was 8 years old. I met Javier when I was 23. He was a foreman on a commercial construction crew, and he had hands like warm stone and a laugh that started in his chest and traveled. He was the first person who looked at me and saw someone who might want something for herself. We married when I was 25. We were saving for a house. In 2003, I put down a $6,400 deposit on an apartment, our first real place together, money I'd scraped together from overtime and skipped lunches. The deposit vanished, returned to the landlord, my mother told me, because of a paperwork issue. I found out 20 years later it had been borrowed to pay for Yolanda's first DUI attorney. Yolanda was 19. She'd driven her boyfriend's car into a fire hydrant in Scottsdale after a pageant after-party. $6,400, my apartment deposit. Nobody told me. Nobody mentioned it. The paperwork issue was real in the sense that my mother had forged my signature on the withdrawal. Javier died when I was 36. A scaffolding collapse on a mixed-use development in Tempe. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. I got the call at my desk at work, and I remember looking at my computer screen and seeing a claim I'd been reviewing, a water damage claim from a restaurant in Glendale, and thinking how strange it was that the world could contain both a flooded kitchen and my husband's body on concrete at the same time. I went home. I sat on our bed. I held that lumpy clay mug, which I hadn't made yet but would make 6 weeks later when my hands needed something to do besides shake. That first night, I held his pillow instead. The life insurance policy was supposed to be $28,000. Javier had taken it out through his union. I was the named beneficiary. I didn't file the claim immediately because I could barely file myself out of bed, and by the time I did, the payout had already been processed, redirected. The beneficiary had been changed 7 years before Javier died to my mother's name. She'd used it to fund Yolanda's salon startup. Yolanda's Glow on Camelback Road with the rose gold signage and the Instagram grid that looked like a magazine. $28,000 of my dead husband's final act of provision, and it bought my sister a reception desk and a La Marzocco espresso machine for her clients. I found this out at my father's funeral. Poppy died of a heart attack, sudden and merciless, and we were at the house afterward, and I was going through his file cabinet looking for the deed to the burial plot. And there it was, the beneficiary change form, my mother's signature, dated 7 years before Javier's accident. I held the paper and the room tilted just slightly, the way it does when your inner ear and your understanding of reality stop agreeing with each other. I put it back in the folder, I closed the drawer, I went to the kitchen and washed dishes for 45 minutes. My hands were in scalding water and I couldn't feel them. Now I want to tell you about Yolanda's husband, Ricardo. Ricardo Vega, developer. His billboards dotted the I-17 corridor, big white smile, hard hat he'd never worn on an actual site, promises about luxury living in emerging neighborhoods. Ricardo was charm. Ricardo was a firm handshake and a wine list, and the kind of man who called every woman darling and made it sound like a promotion. Ricardo's development company, Vega Premier Holdings, had 13 subsidiary LLCs. I know this because I counted them. 13 shells, registered across 3 states, bleeding investor money through a labyrinth of transfers that would have made my fraud department weep with professional admiration. And the guarantor on 6 of those LLCs, the person whose Social Security number appeared on loan applications and lines of credit, totaling nearly $400,000, was my mother. My 71-year-old mother who could not tell you what an LLC was if you spotted her the first 2 letters. I discovered this the way I discover everything, by reading documents other people assumed I'd never see, by doing the math, by being the serious one. Then came the 2 a.m. call. Yolanda, sobbing, the particular kind of sobbing that comes with mascara descriptions, telling me Ricardo's business was in an emergency, telling me I needed to refinance my condo. My condo, the one I'd paid off early by eating rice and beans 3 nights a week for 4 years to save his company. She needed $80,000. She needed it by Friday. She said, "Carmen, you're the only one who can fix this," with the same inflection my mother used when I was 8. I said no. I said it quietly, the way you close a door you're not sure you'll open again, and I hung up. 3 days later, my mother appeared in the lobby of my office, in front of my coworkers, in front of Patricia at reception, who always has a candy dish and opinions. My mother stood in that lobby in her church dress, the one with the blue flowers, and she wept. She wept and she said, loud enough for everyone on the first floor to hear, that I was killing the family. Killing the family were her exact words. Mia, she started with, the way she always started when she needed something, and then, you are killing this family with your selfishness. Patricia looked at me with the expression of a woman recalculating everything she thought she knew. I walked my mother to the parking lot. I held her elbow. I said nothing. My throat had closed so tight I could taste copper. If you're still here, if something in the story is making your chest tight, if you've ever sat with a calculator and watched the numbers add up past what your heart can hold, I need you to stay with me. Hit subscribe and stay, because what I did next is something I'd been training for my entire professional life. I went back to my desk, I opened a new spreadsheet, and I began to do what I do best. I investigated. 18 years of processing insurance fraud had given me something my family never accounted for: an eye for document trails, a tolerance for tedium, a patience for following money through its hiding places. I started with Ricardo's LLCs. I pulled public records. I cross-referenced addresses with registered agents. I found his signature on 6 property liens, 2 of which had notarizations that even a first-year law student would have flagged as forged, both using my mother's identity. I found a pattern so clean it almost impressed me. Ricardo wasn't sloppy. He was systematic. He'd rotate which entity carried the debt, shift liabilities between shells like a cup and ball game, and every time one collapsed, a new one bloomed with my mother's name underneath like fertilizer. Then I found something that changed the temperature of everything. The requests for money, the ones that had come to me over the years, they weren't random. They weren't Yolanda panicking or my mother being dramatic. They were timed. I went back through my bank records and mapped every transfer I'd made against Yolanda's call log and my mother's visits. The calls came within 72 hours of Ricardo's quarterly LLC filing deadlines. Every single time. They had a system. They'd decide who would call and what story to tell. Yolanda's tears on Tuesdays, my mother's guilt on Thursdays. They were taking turns. That's when I stopped being sad. Sadness requires surprise. I wasn't surprised anymore. I was something quieter and more dangerous. I was certain. But here's the part I have to be honest about. The part that cost me sleep for weeks. I let this happen. Not in the way a victim lets something happen. I'm not carrying that water. But I chose, again and again, to be the one who didn't need things. I chose the role because it was the only one my family offered me, and because some part of me believed that if I served well enough, eventually someone would see. Someone would turn to me at a dinner table and say, "Carmen, what do you need?" Nobody ever did, and I kept serving because the alternative, stopping, felt like admitting that the love I was buying with my labor was never going to be freely given. That reckoning happened in my car, in the parking lot of a Fry's grocery store at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday. I sat with the engine off and the windows up, and I let myself feel the full weight of $211,614, and I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, and something in my chest that had been locked for decades opened, and what came out was not tears. It was silence, a vast, clean, resolute silence. I sat in that silence for 20 minutes. When I started the car, I was different. Then Marisol called. Marisol, Javier's sister, who I'd avoided for 8 years because looking at her face was like looking at a window into the room where my husband still existed. She didn't call, actually. She sent a voice memo. I almost deleted it. Her voice was careful, like she was walking across ice. She said, "Carmen, Javier told me everything before he died. He made me promise to reach out when you were ready. I have the letters he wrote you about your family." My finger hovered over delete. The part of me that had been trained to distrust kindness, the part my family built, told me this was manipulation. Someone wanting something, an angle. I let the memo play twice more. The third time, I heard the thing I'd missed. She was afraid, not of me, for me. I called her back. Javier had written 4 letters. He'd known. He'd seen the pattern from outside, the way you can see a city's grid from an airplane that you can't see from the street. He'd documented specific conversations with my mother, specific amounts he'd tracked, specific moments where he'd wanted to say something and I'd asked him not to. Because they're my family, Javier, please. He'd given the letters to Marisol with instructions. She held them for 8 years. Marisol became my ally, not because she gave me advice, but because she gave me recognition. Sitting in her kitchen in Mesa, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs, she looked at me and said, "You're not crazy, Carmen. You were never crazy." 3 sentences. My whole body released something I didn't know I was holding. My shoulders dropped 2 inches. I could breathe below my collarbones for the first time in months. The plan was simple because it didn't need to be complicated. I was not building a bomb. I was dismantling a life support system. I went to my Wednesday pottery class as usual. I came home, I ate dinner, and the following Wednesday during my lunch break while eating a salad at my desk, I opened my bank's website and I began. I changed my direct deposit to a new account at a different bank. I removed myself as emergency contact from 6 accounts: my mother's, Yolanda's, 2 of Ricardo's LLCs, Yolanda's salon operating account, and my mother's landlord's auto-pay portal. I canceled the automatic rent payment I'd been making to my mother's apartment complex for 11 years. I canceled the monthly transfer to Yolanda's salon business account. I removed my name from the cosign on my mother's credit line. Each action took about 90 seconds. Click, confirm, done. Click, confirm, done. I ate a cherry tomato between the 3rd and 4th cancellation. It was a very good tomato. There was one moment where I almost stopped. Yolanda had posted a photo on Instagram that morning. Her son Diego, my nephew, 17 years old, a boy I barely knew because Yolanda kept him in her orbit and away from mine. He was holding a report card, all A's and B's. He looked like Yolanda, but his eyes were serious. My eyes, my father's eyes. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I clicked confirm on the last cancellation. 2 days later, my mother's rent check bounced. 4 days after that, the salon's vendor payments declined. A week later, Ricardo's most recent LLC had its operating account frozen, not by me, but by the federal investigation I'd flagged anonymously 3 months prior, the one that had been quietly building its own case parallel to mine. Yolanda called me 17 times in 4 days. I watched each call ring through to voicemail. The first messages were angry. "Carmen, what did you do? Call me back right now." The third was confused. "I don't understand what's happening. The bank says you removed the auto pay. There must be a mistake." The 7th was bargaining. "Look, I know we haven't always been great about saying thank you, but you can't just do this. People depend on you." The 12th was my mother's voice on Yolanda's phone, trembling, starting with Mija the way it always started. The 17th was silence, 32 seconds of open line, then a hang-up. I saved every one of them, not for evidence, for memory, for the next time my resolve might waver. Ricardo was indicted on federal wire fraud charges 6 weeks later. The asset freeze caught everything: the LLCs, the properties, the development funds. Yolanda's salon was shuttered for back taxes within the month. The IRS doesn't care about rose gold signage. Her real estate license was suspended pending fraud review because her name appeared on enough of Ricardo's paperwork to trigger an association flag. My mother was evicted from the condo I'd been subsidizing for 11 years. She moved into Yolanda's guest room, which was itself about to become someone else's guest room because the house was leveraged against one of Ricardo's frozen assets. I know these details because Marisol told me some, and because public records told me the rest, and because in my line of work, you learn that the truth always surfaces in county databases if you're patient enough to wait. The week Ricardo's indictment hit the news, I drove past Yolanda's salon. The lights were off. A paper sign on the door said, "Closed for renovation." There would be no renovation. Through the window, I could see the La Marzocco espresso machine, the one bought with my husband's life insurance, sitting on the counter like a chrome headstone. I sat in my car and felt nothing dramatic. No vindication, no triumph. Just the strange lightness of a rope you've been pulling against for 20 years suddenly going slack. And then there was the rosary. Abuela died holding my hand. Her last words to me were a promise. The rosary, carved wooden beads from Santiago, handed down from her mother, would be mine. She said my name and she said the rosary. and she squeezed my hand so hard the beads pressed marks into my palm. Yolanda was not in the room. Yolanda was at a callback audition for a car dealership commercial. 3 months before all of this began, before the spreadsheet and the cancellations and the silence, I was walking down a street 2 blocks from Yolanda's salon, and I stopped. In a pawn shop window, between a guitar with a cracked neck and a set of silver candlesticks, there was Abuela's rosary. I knew it the way you know your own hand. The third bead from the crucifix had a crack where I dropped it as a child, and Abuela had glued it back and told me even holy things can break and heal. It was tagged at $45. The pawn shop receipt was dated the day after Abuela's funeral. $45. I stood on that sidewalk, and the desert heat was enormous, and the concrete smelled like dust, and something in me that had been fraying for years finally snapped clean through. I bought it. I put it in my pocket. I went to pottery class and I made a vase, and I destroyed the vase and I made it again. My hands knew what to do, even when the rest of me didn't. That rosary sits on my nightstand now, next to Javier's letters and the lumpy clay mug that cries on one side. 6 weeks after everything collapsed, I booked a trip to Portugal. The credit score notification pinged while I was on the airline's website. 812, the highest it had ever been, because for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't carrying anyone else's financial weight. I was 44 years old, and I had never taken a vacation. 19 years without a single trip that wasn't a funeral or a family obligation. I booked a solo flight to Lisbon, and when I clicked purchase, my hands were steady as stone. Portugal was clay-colored and old, and the light came through the buildings like it had been doing so for centuries and had no plans to stop. I sat in a cafe in Alfama and drank coffee from a cup someone else had made, and I thought about all the cups I'd made, and I thought about all the checks I'd written, and I thought about the sound of my mother's voice saying Micha, and how that word had become a key that unlocked my wallet and nothing else. Then something happened that I did not plan for, that I could not have predicted, and that broke me open in a way no betrayal ever did. Diego, Yolanda's 17-year-old son, my nephew with the serious eyes, found my Pottery Studios Instagram page. He sent me a direct message. It contained a photograph of my grandmother's Bible, the one with the leather cover and the gold-edged pages. Abuela had written my name inside the front cover in her tilted cursive. Carmen Maria Delgado, con todo mi amor. Diego's message said, I saved it from the garage sale. Abuela wrote your name inside. I think you should have it back. I sat in a Portuguese cafe and I cried for the first time in months. Not from pain, from the shock of being seen by someone I'd written off as lost in my sister's orbit. This boy, who I barely knew, had looked at a Bible with my name in it and decided it mattered. He'd hidden it from his own mother. He'd found me on his own. He was 17, and he already understood something my family never had, that the things promised to someone are sacred. Let me tell you something I've learned, not from books or therapy, but from sitting with documents for 18 years. In psychology, they call it parentification. It's when a child is assigned the emotional or financial role of a parent within the family system. Studies show that over 70% of eldest daughters in immigrant families report being given financial responsibilities for the household before the age of 16. 70%. And research from the American Psychological Association found that adults who are financially parentified are 3 times more likely to remain in exploitative financial relationships in adulthood because the pattern feels like love. It feels like purpose. It feels like the only version of yourself your family ever approved of. I was 8 years old when my mother told me I was the eldest, and I understood what that meant. I understood nothing, but I spent 36 years pretending I did, because the alternative was admitting that my family had cast me in a role I never auditioned for and then charged me admission to my own life. Sacrifice is not love when only one person bleeds. I want you to hear that again. Sacrifice is not love when only one person bleeds. If you've ever done the math on what you gave versus what you were promised, and the number made you sit down, you already know. How much did they take before you started counting? Now it's a Tuesday morning in Phoenix, October. The heat has finally broken and the air smells like creosote after rain, that sharp, clean scent the desert gives you as an apology for summer. I'm sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee in the lumpy mug that cries on one side. The rosary is upstairs. The Bible is on the shelf next to Javier's letters. My credit score is 812 and my apartment is quiet, in the way that used to feel like punishment and now feels like architecture. I built this silence. It's mine. Marisol is coming over Thursday. We're going to make pozole and she's going to tell me more about Javier, and I'm going to listen without the sharpness of grief. Just the warmth of someone who loved someone we both loved. That's enough. That's more than enough. Last week, I drove past the apartment complex where my mother used to live, the condo I paid for. Someone else's curtains in the window. I didn't slow down. I drove to my pottery class and I made a mug, a good one this time, even walls, clean glaze. I left it on the studio shelf. I don't need to take everything home. I can make things and let them go. Yolanda sent me a text last month. No request this time, just, I don't know what to say. I read it sitting in my car in the parking lot of the Fry's grocery store where everything changed. I read it and I put my phone in my purse and I went inside and I bought tomatoes and I drove home and I made dinner and I ate it alone in my quiet apartment and it was good. Diego and I text now. He's applying to Arizona State in the fall. He wants to study accounting. I told him I'd help him with his application essays, but I wouldn't write them for him. He laughed. It was a good laugh. It started in his chest like Javier's used to. This morning I held the clay mug and I noticed something I'd never seen before. On the side that droops, where the glaze pooled and hardened into what looks like a tear, the morning light catches it, and it looks less like crying and more like a river finding its way down a mountain. Not broken, moving, going somewhere. I'm telling you this from the other side. Not the other side of anger. I still have that, and I think it keeps me honest. The other side of silence. I spoke up by going quiet. I fought back by walking away. I won by stopping the one thing I'd been doing my whole life, paying for the privilege of being needed. So wherever you're listening from right now, whatever kitchen table or car seat or quiet room holds you tonight, I want to ask you something. What would you have done? If you had found the rosary in the window, if you had seen the number on the calculator, if you had heard Mija one more time and known exactly what it cost, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from. And if this story found the part of you that's been doing the math in silence, if you felt your chest tighten at the number or your jaw set at the pawn shop window, then you're not alone. Like this. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe because there are more stories like this, and every one of them belongs to someone who stopped bleeding so their family could shine. $211,614. That was the price of being invisible. But the mug on my counter, the one I made with shaking hands, the one that holds my coffee every morning in my quiet apartment in Phoenix, that one was free.